Welcome to Passionate Reply, and welcome to Great Albums. It's been a while since I tackled a subject more firmly rooted in the realm of industrial music, so in this installment I'll be taking a look at the debut LP of one of the most iconic groups of second wave industrial and the definitive representatives of electronic body music, Front 242 and their 1982 debut album, Geography. If you're already familiar with Front 242, you probably know them as the trio behind club staples like 1988's Headhunter. But as a starting point, Geography is significantly removed from that sort of sound, and perhaps surprisingly, doesn't have a lot of dance floor sensibilities to it at all. Weighty and despondent, With Your Cries is nothing to dance to, but rather sets a dismal mood with its plodding pace, strident synth interruptions, and lyrics that portray social alienation in an accusatory, second-person frame of reference. While Geography's cohesive sonic blueprint is full of traditionally industrial features like oscillating textures and heavy percussion, it's tracks like this one that make me think this album could perhaps garner a bit more crossover appeal than it does. In many ways, it reminds me as much of minimal synth as it does EBM, or anything else traditionally classed under the umbrella of industrial, particularly on the strikingly melodic track GVDT. The 1980s were full of avant-garde electronic artists who took inspiration from the 1950s, from Bill Nelson to Klaus Nomi. Perhaps more so than anything else, GVDT reminds me of OMD's cover of The More I See You on their sophomore LP Organization. Between the jarring electronic textures and the perhaps sarcastic or tongue-in-cheek delivery of its playful melody, GVDT comes across as more of a parody or send-up of traditional pop, rather than the fond homages favored by some contemporary artists. It's also worth noting that GVDT, like the album opener Operating Tracks, makes use of sampling. Fans of Front 242's later work will be well aware of just how far the group's penchant for sampling would go later on, but the extent to which sampling is used on this album is quite different. While later tracks like Master Hit would elevate samples to where they almost seem to serve as lead vocals, the samples here on Geography are relatively brief and more used to add textural interest to their respective tracks than attention-grabbing hooks. Speaking of texture, it's also worth noting the extent to which Geography is dominated by instrumentals, such as the closer for the first side, Dialogues. Instrumental interludes on primarily vocal albums are nothing new. Something that does feel unique about Geography is the extent to which it seems to treat both instrumental and vocal tracks as equally important. While the longest track is vocal and the shortest track is instrumental, the average length within each group is similar overall, unlike some albums whose instrumentals tend to be much shorter. Geography's instrumentals, such as dialogues, eschew the other common pattern wherein instrumentals tend toward providing ambiance or rest between more attention-seeking vocal tracks. Instead, this album's instrumental tracks are more of a continuation of the musical themes you'll find elsewhere, and feel as though they differ from the vocal tracks only in their lack of vocals. They even have their own titles, as opposed to being named Interlude 4 and such like, which also makes them feel more like thoughtful, deliberate, and vital inclusions on the album. Dialogues in particular seems to recall the lyrics of With Your Cries, which portrays the difficulties of communicating via words, and contrasts the double meanings that can be had in speech with the titular wordless cries of unambiguous and unpretentious woe. Titling an instrumental track Dialogues is, of course, not without irony, but in the context of the album it seems to make sense. A use of the language of music to say something that words perhaps cannot. Overall, the weightiness of the album's instrumentals is something that I can really appreciate, as a fan of instrumental music who's often irked by the way some listeners see it as disposable or less valid of an art form. That aside, for as much as I've emphasized the ways I think Geography differs from Front 242's later, perhaps better known work, I think it's also worth mentioning that there are a fair number of similarities too. While it differs in significant ways, it's also still very much a Front 242 album, and I certainly wouldn't discourage fans of the group or EBM in general from checking it out if they haven't already. Listening to stomping, insistent tracks like You Men with its shouty, proto-Nitzer Ebb hook, I think it's easy to envision what would come next for Front 242. At first glance, it might be hard to make out what's happening on the cover of Geography, and the album's title is not a very good hint. But after a few seconds, you should be able to see the distorted black and white shapes as coming from a distorted photograph of a human being, albeit one of fairly ambiguous gender. The brightly colored test strip design that flanks the cover's left side is also evocative of photography and contributes to the theme of photography as deficient reproduction of the real world. A common theme in underground zines, as well as album covers of the late 70s and early 80s, the suspicion of photography represents a criticism of our increasingly technological world, as well as the role that media plays in it. The abrasion and elimination of the human form, and/or the anonymization of a disposable human being, is a theme that emerges from the image of a person who is rendered almost unrecognizable by a machine, in this case, the camera. As I mentioned earlier, the album's title, Geography, is a word that takes us out of a human context, and perhaps suggests a landscape devoid of mankind. Front 242's next major follow-up to Geography would be 1984's No Comment. Though with just 6 tracks, it's arguably closer to a mini LP than a full-length release. No Comment has some similarities with Geography, but it's also in many ways a more experimental album, and features an increased emphasis on sampling, among other things. I think it's worth a listen for fans of this album, especially given that it is a bit shorter, so you've got less to lose. My favorite track on No Comment is Lovely Day, a tale of lost love that feels more like an actual pop song than anything else from Front 242. Strident synth drilling notwithstanding, of course.
It was a lovely
My favorite track on Geography is one of its instrumentals, Art and Strategy. With a springy, sprightly hook that refuses to be ignored, it just might be the most scene-stealing instrumental the album has to offer. And its title is one I always stop to think about. What is the relationship between art and strategy that's being implied here? Is strategy a kind of art? Something subjective, nuanced, and grounded in emotion? Or is art a kind of strategy? Something decisively calculated to achieve some certain result? On that note, that's all I have for today. So thanks, as always, for listening.